There are moments in war when defeat arrives not with thunder, but with silence. In the winter of 1944, along the frozen forests of the Ardennes, German snipers began collecting American rifles from fallen soldiers. What started as routine scavenging became an investigation that would expose a truth more devastating than any bullet. They had been fighting with inferior weapons for years, and their commanders knew it. The discovery began with Oberjäger Heinrich Müller, a veteran marksman with 43 confirmed kills stationed near the Belgian border. On December 18th, after a skirmish left 3 American soldiers dead in a collapsed farmhouse, Müller retrieved an M1 Garand rifle from the snow. The weapon was heavier than his Karabiner 98K, its wood darker, its mechanism unfamiliar. He carried it back to the observation post, not as a trophy, but as a question. That night, under the dim light of a kerosene lamp, Müller disassembled the American rifle with the precision of a watchmaker. What he found disturbed him. The gas-operated system allowed semi-automatic fire. 8 rounds per magazine. No need to manually cycle the bolt after each shot. The steel showed signs of industrial consistency he had not seen in German weapons for over a year. The barrel rifling was precise, uniform, untouched by the material shortages that plagued the Reich's factories. Müller shared his findings with his unit commander, Hauptmann Josef Krebs, who had been a ballistics engineer before the war. Krebs examined the rifle in silence, his face hardening with each measurement. He ordered Müller to collect more American weapons. Within 3 days, the unit had assembled 7 M1 Garands, 4 M1 carbines, and 2 Springfield rifles. They did not report this to higher command, not yet. On December 22nd, Krebs organized a field test in a clearing 2 kilometers behind German lines. 6 snipers participated, including Müller, each firing both their standard-issue Karabiner 98K and a captured M1 Garand at wooden targets placed at distances of 200, 400 and 600 meters. The results were documented in Krebs's personal journal, a leather-bound notebook that would remain hidden for 37 years. The M1 Garand delivered consistent accuracy at all ranges. The semi-automatic mechanism allowed follow-up shots within 2 seconds. The recoil was manageable. The sights were clear even in low light. Most troubling, the steel did not warp under sustained fire. Müller fired 20 consecutive rounds, and the barrel remained true. When he switched back to his Karabiner 98K, he felt the difference immediately. The bolt was stiff, the barrel slightly bent from thermal stress, the woodstock cracked from months of freezing moisture. Krebs wrote in his journal that night, "We are not losing because our men lack skill. We are losing because our weapons are dying in our hands." The news spread quietly through the sniper units. Other marksmen began testing captured American rifles. Reports filtered back from different sectors of the front: the Hürtgen Forest, the Roya River, the outskirts of Bastogne. The pattern was identical. American rifles were faster, more reliable, and built with materials that German factories could no longer provide. Manganese steel had become scarce. Quality control had collapsed under Allied bombing. Rifles manufactured in 1944 were inferior to those produced in 1941. By early January 1945, a small group of veteran snipers had compiled a technical dossier. They documented barrel wear, firing pin failures, stock fractures, and trigger mechanism degradation. They compared metallurgical composition based on visual inspection and field performance. They recorded ammunition inconsistencies. Some cartridges misfired, others produced irregular pressures that damaged chambers. The dossier was delivered to the Wehrmacht's Small Arms Testing Office in Berlin on January 14, 1945. It was signed by 11 snipers, including Müller and 4 others who had served since 1941. The cover page contained a single sentence: "Our men are being sent into duels they cannot win." The response came 3 weeks later. An order stamped "Classified, command eyes only," instructed all units to cease testing enemy weapons and to destroy any comparative reports. The official reason: concerns about morale. The real reason, as Krebs would later testify, was that the High Command already knew. Müller returned to the front lines in February, carrying his Karabiner 98K. He would survive the war, but 52 of his fellow snipers would not. In the frozen forests, in the ruined villages, in the final desperate days before surrender, German marksmen faced American riflemen, knowing they were outgunned not by training, but by industry. The American rifles kept firing, the German rifles kept failing, and between those two facts lay the mathematics of a war already lost. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. The name Franz Becker does not appear in histories of the Second World War. He was not a general, not a politician, not a strategist. He was a metallurgical engineer at the Oberndorf arms factory, and in the spring of 1943, he wrote a report that no one wanted to read. Becker had worked at Mauserwerke since 1936, overseeing quality control for the Karabiner 98K production line. He was 41 years old, meticulous, and deeply concerned with the integrity of steel. His colleagues described him as a man who spoke in technical specifications and slept poorly when tolerances were violated. In March 1943, he began noticing irregularities in the barrel blanks arriving from the Ruhr foundries. The steel was brittle. Microscopic analysis revealed insufficient manganese content, replaced with cheaper alloys to compensate for material shortages. The barrels passed visual inspection, but under sustained firing, they warped. The rifling degraded. Accuracy suffered after 200 rounds. Becker documented everything in a 73-page report titled Material Degradation and Combat Reliability in Current Karabiner 98K Production. He submitted the report to the factory director on April 2, 1943. The director forwarded it to the Army Weapons Office. The Army Weapons Office filed it without response. Becker submitted it again in June, this time directly to the Ministry of Armaments. Albert Speer's deputy sent a brief acknowledgement. Material constraints are known. Production must continue. Becker did not stop. He began a second investigation, this time comparing German rifles to captured Soviet Mosin Nagants and British Lee Enfields. The Soviet rifles were crude but durable. The British rifles showed superior machining. The German rifles, once the finest in Europe, were now failing at rates that would have been unacceptable in peacetime. Becker calculated that 23% of Karabiner 98K rifles manufactured after January 1943 would experience critical failures within their first year of combat use. In September 1943, Becker requested permission to travel to the Eastern Front to inspect returned weapons. Permission was denied. He requested access to combat failure reports from field units. Access was denied. He wrote directly to General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the replacement army, outlining the technical crisis. Fromm's office responded with a warning. Further unsanctioned reports would be considered defeatist propaganda. Becker kept working. He could not stop the production line, but he could document the collapse. He photographed fractured barrels. He catalogued firing pin failures. He interviewed returning soldiers who described rifles jamming in sub-zero temperatures, stocks splitting under recoil, sights misaligning after minimal use. He compiled a second report, twice as long as the first, titled The Industrial Failure Behind the Front Lines. On November 17, 1943, Becker was summoned to the factory director's office. 2 Gestapo officers were waiting. They informed him that his reports had been classified as demoralizing to the war effort, and that further distribution would result in arrest. Becker was transferred to a clerical position, removed from the production floor, and forbidden from accessing metallurgical data. He spent the remainder of the war filing procurement forms in a basement office. His reports were sealed in a storage facility outside Munich. The rifles continued rolling off the assembly line, 900 per day, each one carrying the flaws he had documented. By the time Müller and Krebs were testing captured American rifles in the Ardennes, over 400,000 carabiner 98K rifles with substandard steel had been distributed to German forces. After the war, Becker was interviewed by American technical intelligence officers. He was 53 years old, gaunt and visibly exhausted. He brought his copies of the reports hidden in his sister's attic throughout the occupation. The American officers read them with growing astonishment. One lieutenant, a former metallurgist from Pittsburgh, told Becker, "If your command had listened to you in 1943, you might have saved 10,000 lives." Becker's response was recorded in the interview transcript. "I tried to save rifles. I did not realize I was trying to save men." He returned to Oberndorf after the occupation, working as a consultant for a civilian tool-making firm. He never spoke publicly about his wartime reports. In 1952, a German Veterans Association invited him to a memorial service. He declined. In 1957, a military historian requested an interview. He declined. In 1961, the West German government awarded him a modest pension for his engineering work. He accepted without ceremony. Franz Becker died in 1969 at the age of 67 in a small apartment overlooking the Neckar River. Among his possessions were the original copies of his reports, annotated with dates and rejection stamps. His nephew donated them to the Bundesarchiv in 1984, where they remain in the restricted technical documents section. The rifles he tried to fix are now displayed in museums, labeled as examples of German engineering. Few visitors know that the engineer who warned of their failure spent 2 years begging someone to listen. The steel remembers what the histories forget. On January 9, 1945, in a requisitioned schoolhouse 12 kilometers south of St. Vith, 8 German snipers gathered for a test that their commanders would later deny ever happened. The room smelled of damp wood and kerosene. Snow pressed against the windows. On a wooden table lay 2 rifles, a carabiner 98K manufactured in October 1944 and an M1 Garand captured 3 days earlier from an American corporal near Malmedy. Hauptmann Josef Krebs had organized the demonstration without official authorization. He had invited officers from 3 neighboring battalions, including a liaison from the 12th SS Panzer Division and a logistics captain who had spent 6 months managing rifle distribution. The attendees arrived quietly, without formal record. This was not an inspection, it was an autopsy. Krebs began with the technical specifications. He spoke without notes, his voice steady and clinical. The carabiner, 98K, bolt action, 5-round internal magazine, effective range 600 meters under ideal conditions. The M1 Garand, semi-automatic 8-round en bloc clip, gas-operated, effective range 800 meters with consistent accuracy. He did not editorialize, he simply described what the metal could do. Then he invited Oberjäger Heinrich Müller to demonstrate. Müller was the finest marksman in the unit, a man who had fired over 12,000 rounds in combat and survived encounters that killed younger snipers. He approached the table, lifted the carabiner 98K, and performed a function check. The bolt moved with resistance. The trigger required excessive pressure. The wood stock showed hairline cracks near the receiver. Müller said nothing. He set the rifle down and picked up the M1 Garand. The American rifle was heavier, but the weight felt deliberate, engineered. The action cycled smoothly. The trigger broke cleanly. The sights were wide and luminous, designed for rapid target acquisition. Müller loaded an 8-round clip and heard the distinctive ping as the follower engaged. He worked the charging handle, the first round chambered with mechanical certainty. Krebs had arranged targets in the schoolyard. Wooden planks marked at 50-meter intervals, extending to 300 meters. The test was simple. Fire 10 rounds from each rifle at the 200-meter target, recording time and accuracy. Müller would shoot. Two other snipers would observe with binoculars. A junior officer would record the results. Müller fired the carabiner 98K first. Each shot required him to manually cycle the bolt, eject the spent casing, chamber the next round, reacquire the target, and fire. 10 rounds took 53 seconds. 7 hit the target. 3 missed due to the delay between shots as the target's silhouette simulated movement. The rifle's barrel grew warm. The bolt became slightly harder to operate with each cycle. Then Müller fired the M1 Garand. The semi-automatic action allowed him to maintain sight picture between shots. No need to break his cheek weld. No need to lower the rifle. He fired 10 rounds in 18 seconds. All 10 hit the target. The grouping was tighter. The follow-up shots were faster. When the clip ejected with its signature ping, Müller reloaded in 4 seconds and continued firing. The room was silent. The liaison from the SS Panzer Division leaned forward, his face unreadable. The logistics captain scribbled notes on a torn envelope. One of the observing snipers, a man named Otto Frey, who had fought in North Africa and Russia, said quietly, "We have been losing duels since 1943, and now I understand why." Krebs then demonstrated the mechanical differences. He disassembled both rifles on the table, laying out the components in parallel rows. The carabiner 98K's parts showed wear. The firing pin was slightly deformed. The extractor claw was loose. The barrel showed heat discoloration near the chamber. The rifle had been manufactured 4 months earlier and had fired fewer than 800 rounds. The M1 Garand's parts were pristine. The gas piston showed minimal carbon buildup. The bolt lugs were evenly worn. The barrel's interior rifling was sharp and consistent. Krebs estimated the rifle had fired over 2,000 rounds and remained fully functional. He pointed to the steel composition, the machining precision, the design tolerances that allowed the weapon to function in mud, snow, and sustained fire. "This is not about marksmanship," Krebs said. "This is about infrastructure." The logistics captain asked the question no one else dared. Why were we not informed? Krebs pulled a folder from his coat. Inside were copies of Franz Becker's 1943 metallurgical reports, obtained through a contact at the Oberndorf factory. He read excerpts aloud, the warnings about manganese shortages, the predictions of barrel failure, the requests for material reallocation that were denied. "We were informed," Krebs said. Command chose not to listen. The meeting lasted 2 hours. No official minutes were recorded. The attendees left separately, at intervals, returning to their units without discussion. Krebs collected the test data and stored it in a locked ammunition crate. 3 days later, he received orders to report to divisional headquarters in Prüm. He was informed that unauthorized weapons testing was prohibited and that his findings were classified. Krebs asked if the High Command intended to address the rifle crisis. The divisional commander, a colonel who had lost his left hand at Stalingrad, looked at him with exhausted clarity. "Hauptmann, the war is already over. We are simply waiting for the paperwork." Krebs returned to his unit. The test results were never formally submitted. The schoolhouse was destroyed by American artillery on January 21, 1945. The wooden table, the targets, and the evidence of what 8 snipers had witnessed were buried under rubble and snow. But the men who attended that demonstration carried the knowledge with them. They returned to the front lines, knowing their rifles were inferior, their complaints ignored, and their survival dependent on skill that could no longer compensate for industrial failure. The trigger was pulled. The bolt was cycled. The war continued. And in the frozen forests, German snipers kept dying in duels they had already lost before the first shot was fired. On February 3, 1945, Oberjäger Heinrich Müller sat in a half-collapsed barn near the village of Honsfeld and wrote a letter to his younger brother, Ernst, who was serving as a tank mechanic in the 21st Panzer Division outside Bitburg. The letter was 7 pages long, written in pencil on the back of requisition forms. It was never sent. Müller folded it, placed it inside his field jacket, and carried it through the final months of the war. It was found in 1981 by a Belgian farmer clearing debris from a forgotten German position. The farmer gave it to a local historian who translated it and published excerpts in a small academic journal. The letter is now archived at the Imperial War Museum in London. The letter begins with routine details: weather, rations, the names of men recently killed. Then, halfway through the second page, Müller's tone shifts. He describes the captured M1 Garand, the field tests, Krebs's demonstration, and the mechanical superiority of American weapons. He writes with the precision of a man who has spent years observing minute details through a rifle scope. "Ernst, I need you to understand something," Müller wrote. "We are not losing because the Americans are better soldiers. We are losing because their rifles do not fail. I have fired the Carabiner 98K for 4 years. I know its weight, its balance, its tendencies. I can compensate for wind, for distance, for the slight pull to the left that every model develops after 500 rounds. But I cannot compensate for a barrel that warps after sustained fire. I cannot compensate for a bolt that jams in freezing rain. I cannot compensate for ammunition that misfires 1 round in every 30. He describes a duel that occurred on January 27th near a burned-out farmhouse. An American sniper had taken position in a grain silo 400 meters away. Müller spotted him first, a shadow behind a broken window, the faint glint of a scope lens. Müller fired. The round struck low, deflected by a crosswind he had misjudged by 1/2 degree. He cycled the bolt to chamber the next round. The bolt stuck. The extractor had failed to fully eject the spent casing. In the 3 seconds it took Müller to clear the jam, the American sniper fired twice. Both rounds struck the sandbags inches from Müller's head. Müller abandoned his position and retreated through a drainage ditch. The American did not pursue. He did not need to. He had won the duel by firing faster. "I am alive because he missed," Müller wrote. "But Ernst, he will not miss forever. None of them will. They have rifles that fire as fast as they can pull the trigger, and we are still working bolts like men from the last war." The letter continues with technical observations. Müller notes that American snipers are trained differently. They rely on volume of fire, suppressing targets with rapid semi-automatic shots, rather than waiting for the perfect single shot. German doctrine, built around the bolt-action rifle, emphasizes patience and precision. But precision means nothing when the enemy can fire 8 rounds in the time it takes to fire 3. Müller also describes the psychological toll. He writes about younger snipers, men trained in 1944, who are being sent to the front with rifles that malfunction in their first engagement. He mentions Franz Dietrich, a 20-year-old sniper from Munich who was killed on January 19th when his rifle's firing pin broke during a firefight. Dietrich had fired 4 rounds. The 5th did not discharge. He attempted to clear the malfunction and was shot through the chest by an American rifleman using an M1 carbine. "They gave him a rifle that killed him as surely as the enemy did," Müller wrote, "and they will give me another rifle just like it when this one fails." Near the end of the letter, Müller describes a conversation with Krebs. They had been sitting in a forward observation post, drinking ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, watching snow fall over the forest. Krebs had asked Müller how many more duels he thought he could survive. Müller said he did not know. Krebs said it did not matter. The duels would continue until there were no more snipers left to lose them. "We are not fighting a war anymore," Krebs had said. "We are documenting a collapse." Müller ends the letter with instructions for Ernst. If Müller is killed, Ernst should not mourn him as a soldier who died in honorable combat. He should mourn him as a worker who was given faulty tools and sent into conditions where those tools could only fail. Müller writes that he does not blame the enemy. He blames the factories, the ministries, the officers who ignored the engineers, and the system that prioritized production over functionality. "Tell our mother I tried," Müller wrote. "Tell her I did everything I was trained to do, but tell her also that I was given a rifle that could not do what I needed it to do, and that is not a failure of will, it is a failure of steel." The letter was never sent because there was no reliable mail service by early February 1945. Müller kept it with him, perhaps intending to deliver it personally if he survived. He did survive. He was captured by American forces on March 8, 1945, near Remagen, and spent 14 months in a POW camp in Louisiana. He returned to Germany in 1946, found his brother alive, and gave him the letter in person. Ernst Müller kept the letter in a wooden box for 35 years. When he died in 1981, his son found it among his father's belongings and donated it to a historian researching German sniper tactics. The historian recognized its significance immediately, not as a tactical document, but as a moral one. The letter is now displayed in a glass case, yellowed and fragile, the pencil marks fading. Visitors read it and see a soldier's frustration with his equipment. Historians read it and see the collapse of an industrial base under wartime strain. But those who understand the language of engineers and marksmen read it and see something simpler, a man who knew he was being sent to fail and who wanted someone to know that he understood why. The war ended. The rifles were scrapped. But the words remained, written in pencil by a man who survived long enough to explain what the steel could not. If this story surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. In November 1947, in a displaced persons camp outside Frankfurt, an American technical intelligence officer named Captain David Brenner interviewed a man who had spent 4 years trying to prevent the collapse documented by Müller and Krebs. His name was Franz Becker, and he had been the senior metallurgical engineer at Mauser Werke in Oberndorf. The interview lasted 6 hours and was recorded on a wire spool recorder. The transcript is 43 pages long. It has never been fully published. Becker was 51 years old, thin, his hands trembling slightly from malnutrition and exhaustion. He spoke in careful, technical German, which Brenner's translator rendered into flat, precise English. Becker did not offer justifications or excuses. He described what had happened to German rifle production, with the detachment of a pathologist performing an autopsy on his own work. The collapse began in 1942, Becker said. Not with a decision, but with an absence of decisions. He explained that Mauser Werke had been producing the Karabiner 98K since 1935 using manganese alloy steel sourced from the Ruhr and Silesian foundries. The steel met strict specifications: tensile strength, hardness, thermal stability under sustained fire. The rifles were reliable, accurate, and durable. German snipers trusted them because the metal did not lie. But by mid-1942, Allied bombing campaigns had disrupted supply chains. Manganese shipments from the Soviet Union, previously acquired through trade agreements before Operation Barbarossa, ceased entirely. Domestic manganese reserves were redirected to tank armor and aircraft components. The foundries began substituting cheaper alloys, increased carbon content, reduced manganese, trace amounts of phosphorus to improve machinability. Becker ran tests on the new steel in September 1942. The results were unambiguous. Barrels would warp under sustained fire, extractors would wear prematurely, firing pins would fracture under repeated stress. He submitted his findings to the factory director, who forwarded them to the Army Weapons Office. The response came in October. Production quotas must be maintained. Material substitutions were acceptable if visual inspection standards were met. They did not care about metallurgical integrity, Becker said. They cared about production numbers. Becker continued testing. He examined returned rifles from the Eastern Front, weapons that had been in service for less than 6 months, but showed wear patterns typical of rifles fired for 2 years. He documented barrel erosion, bolt failures, stock fractures. He calculated failure rates. By early 1943, An estimated 18% of newly manufactured carabiner 98K rifles would experience critical malfunctions within their first year of combat use. In March 1943, Becker wrote his first comprehensive report. It was 73 pages, supported by microscopic analysis, thermal testing data, and field failure statistics. He recommended immediate reallocation of manganese supplies, revised production standards, and a recall of rifles manufactured after June 1942. The report was submitted to Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments. The ministry's response arrived in May. Material constraints were unavoidable. Production must continue. Further reports on this subject were unnecessary. Becker was instructed to focus on optimizing current production methods rather than criticizing material quality. "They told me to make the steel work," Becker said, "but steel does not negotiate." Becker did not stop. He began a second investigation, comparing German rifles to captured enemy weapons. He obtained a Soviet Mosin Nagant, a British Lee Enfield, and through a contact in the Wehrmacht testing division, an American M1 Garand captured in North Africa. He disassembled all three and examined their metallurgy, machining, and design tolerances. The Soviet rifle was crude but functional, designed for mass production and minimal maintenance. The British rifle showed superior machining and material quality, though its design was outdated. The American rifle was exceptional. Gas-operated semi-automatic action, high-quality steel, precision manufacturing, and design margins that allowed the weapon to function under extreme conditions. "I realized we were not losing a tactical war," Becker said. "We were losing an industrial war. The Americans had the steel we used to have, and we had the steel we would have rejected 10 years earlier." In September 1943, Becker wrote his second report. It was 147 pages. It compared German production methods to Allied methods, analyzed material degradation trends, and projected that by mid-1944, German rifle reliability would fall below acceptable combat standards. He recommended an immediate halt to production using substandard steel, even if it meant reducing output by 30%. The report was classified as defeatist propaganda. Becker was summoned by the Gestapo on November 17, 1943. He was informed that further unsanctioned reports would result in arrest. He was transferred to clerical duties, removed from the production floor, and forbidden from accessing metallurgical data. "They did not want the truth," Becker said. "They wanted the lie that production could continue without consequence." Becker spent the rest of the war filing procurement forms in a basement office. He watched rifles roll off the assembly line, knowing they would fail. He heard reports from the front, rifles jamming in cold weather, barrels warping after minimal use, extractors breaking during combat. He kept copies of his reports hidden in his sister's attic, along with sample components, test data, and photographs of fractured steel. When Captain Brenner asked why Becker had continued documenting the failures even after being silenced, Becker paused for a long moment. The translator noted that Becker's hands were shaking. "Because someone needed to know," Becker said. "Because the men who carried those rifles deserved to know that their deaths were not failures of courage. They were failures of steel." Brenner asked if Becker believed his reports could have changed the outcome of the war. Becker said no. By the time the material crisis became undeniable, Germany's industrial capacity was already collapsing under Allied bombing. Even with perfect steel, the outcome would have been the same. But the men might have survived longer. The duels might have been fairer. "We sent them to fight with tools that could not win," Becker said, "and we told them it was their fault when they lost." The interview concluded at 4:47 p.m. on November 14, 1947. Brenner submitted his report to the U.S. Army's Foreign Intelligence Division, where it was classified and stored in a vault at Fort Meade. It was declassified in 1983, 41 years after Becker first warned that the steel was failing. Franz Becker returned to Oberndorf in 1948. He worked as a consultant for civilian tool-making firms. He never spoke publicly about his wartime reports. He declined interviews, memorial invitations, and requests for testimony. In 1961, the West German government awarded him a modest pension for his contributions to industrial engineering. He accepted without ceremony. Becker died in 1969. Among his possessions were the original copies of his reports, annotated with rejection stamps, dated responses, and his own handwritten notes in the margins. His nephew donated them to the Bundesarchiv in 1984. The reports are now stored in a climate-controlled archive in Berlin, filed under Technical Documents, Small Arms Production, 1942-1945. Researchers occasionally request access. The documents are dry, technical, filled with measurements and metallurgical terminology. But beneath the data is a simpler truth. A man tried to tell the truth about failing steel, and no one wanted to listen. The rifles kept failing. The snipers kept dying. And the engineer who warned them spent 26 years living with the knowledge that he had been right too early and silenced too late. On March 6, 1945, in a forest clearing 3 kilometers west of Remagen, Oberjäger Heinrich Müller engaged in his final sniper duel. It lasted 7 minutes. No one else witnessed it. There is no official record. The only evidence is Müller's own account, recorded during his interrogation by American intelligence officers on March 9, 1945, after his capture near the collapsed Ludendorff Bridge. The interrogation transcript is stored at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. File number RG319IRR-XE008472. Müller's testimony is brief, factual, and devoid of emotion. But those who read it carefully recognize it as the final statement of a man who understood exactly why he lost. Müller had been retreating with the remnants of his unit for 3 days. The American First Army had crossed the Rhine at Remagen on March 7th, and German forces were collapsing in disorganized clusters. Müller's unit, originally 43 men, had been reduced to 11. They were moving northeast through dense forest, attempting to reach German lines near Bonn. At approximately 2:20 p.m. on March 6th, Müller's group encountered an American reconnaissance patrol. A brief firefight erupted. The Germans scattered into the trees. Müller took position behind a fallen oak, his carabiner 98K loaded with 5 rounds. He had 32 additional rounds in his ammunition pouch. The rifle had been issued to him in January 1945, manufactured in December 1944. He had fired it fewer than 200 times. It had already jammed twice. Müller observed the American patrol through his scope. 8 soldiers, moving in dispersed formation, wearing new uniforms and carrying M1 Garand rifles. One soldier moved differently, with deliberate caution, scanning tree lines and shadows. Müller recognized the behavior, another sniper. The American sniper took position behind a stone wall 60 meters to Müller's left. The distance between them was approximately 340 meters. Both men were concealed. Both men knew the other was present. The duel began without signal or declaration. It began because both men understood that survival required the other's death. Müller fired first. He had identified the American's position by the faint movement of branches when the sniper settled into his hide. Müller aimed for the gap between 2 stones where he estimated the American's head would be. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and fired. The round struck the stone 6 centimeters high. The American did not flinch. He had not been hit. Müller cycled the bolt. The spent casing ejected cleanly. He chambered the next round and reacquired his sight picture. He aimed lower, compensating for the first shot's deviation. Before he could fire, the American responded. 3 rounds struck the oak trunk above Müller's head within 2 seconds. The American had not fired a single aimed shot. He had fired rapidly, suppressing Müller's position, forcing him to take cover. Müller pressed himself flat against the ground. Wood splinters fell on his helmet. He counted 1, 2, 3. The American was using an M1 Garand, 8-round capacity. He had fired 3. He had 5 remaining before needing to reload. Müller repositioned, moving 3 meters to his right, using the oak's root system for cover. He rose slowly, bringing the rifle to his shoulder. The American fired again, 2 more rounds striking the ground near Müller's previous position. The American was adjusting, tracking Müller's movement. Müller fired his second shot. This time he aimed for the muzzle flash, the one element he could confirm. The round struck the stone wall, ricocheted, and disappeared into the forest. The American did not return fire immediately. Müller realized why. The American was repositioning, moving to a new angle, while Müller was forced to cycle his bolt. This was the fundamental inequality. Müller had to manually operate his rifle's action after every shot. The American simply pulled the trigger 8 times. In the seconds it took Müller to work the bolt, the American could fire, reposition, and fire again. Müller cycled the bolt. The extractor caught on the casing rim, requiring an extra pull to eject. Half a second lost. He chambered the 3rd round and scanned for the American's new position. He saw nothing. The forest was silent. Then the American fired again, a single shot, deliberate and aimed. The round passed 10 centimeters to the left of Müller's head. Müller dropped behind the oak. The American had relocated to a higher position, 40 meters to the north, gaining elevation advantage. Müller had not seen him move. The American had moved while Müller was working his bolt. Müller had 3 rounds remaining in his rifle. He had no clear shot. The American had at least 3 rounds remaining, possibly more if he had reloaded. The mathematics were simple. Müller could not win through accuracy alone. He needed to close the distance or retreat. Müller chose retreat. He fired his 3rd round blindly toward the American's last known position, then immediately displaced, running in a low crouch toward a depression 15 meters to his rear. The American fired twice. Both rounds struck trees near Müller's path. Müller reached the depression and rolled into cover. He had 2 rounds left. His heart was pounding. His breath came in short bursts. He forced himself to slow down, to think tactically. The American had not pursued. He was waiting, conserving ammunition, forcing Müller to make the next move. Müller realized he could not win this duel. The rifle in his hands could not deliver fire fast enough to suppress the enemy. The bolt-action mechanism that had been sufficient in 1941 was obsolete in 1945. Every shot required him to break his sight picture, manually cycle the action, and reacquire the target. The American simply aimed and fired, maintaining continuous pressure. Müller made his decision. He abandoned his rifle. He drew his sidearm, a Walter P-38 pistol, and moved south away from the American's position, using terrain to mask his withdrawal. He heard no further shots. The American did not follow. There was no need. The duel was over. Müller rejoined his unit an hour later. He reported the encounter to his commanding officer, who asked if Müller had eliminated the threat. Müller said no. The officer asked why. Müller said, "Because I had the wrong rifle." 3 days later, Müller was captured near Remagen. During his interrogation, the American intelligence officer asked about his service record. Müller described his training, his combat experience, and the duel in the forest. The officer asked why Müller had retreated. Müller's response is recorded on page 6 of the interrogation transcript. "I did not retreat because I was afraid. I retreated because my weapon could not match his. He fired 8 times while I fired 3. He suppressed my position while I was forced to work a bolt. This is not a question of skill. This is a question of machinery." The interrogating officer noted in his report that Müller demonstrated exceptional understanding of tactical realities and appeared to possess no ideological commitment to continued resistance. Müller was processed as a standard POW and transferred to a camp in Louisiana. He was repatriated to Germany in June 1946. Müller never learned the identity of the American sniper he faced on March 6, 1945. The American never learned Müller's identity. They fought one duel across 340 meters of forest, and the outcome was determined before the first shot was fired. The rifles decided the war. The men simply carried them. 73 years after the last shots were fired in the forests near Remagen, a German military historian named Dr. Klaus Hoffmann sat in the reading room of the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, reviewing declassified documents from the Second World War. He was researching small arms production and had requested files on quality control reports from Mauser Werke between 1942 and 1945. Among the documents was Franz Becker's metallurgical report from March 1943, stamped "Classified, not for distribution," annotated with rejection notices, and filed away for 40 years. Hoffmann read it twice, then requested additional files. He found Becker's second report from September 1943, equally ignored. He found internal Wehrmacht memos discussing morale concerns related to weapons reliability. He found a directive from the Army Weapons Office instructing field units to cease comparative testing of captured enemy rifles. Hoffmann cross-referenced these documents with post-war Allied intelligence reports. He discovered Captain David Brenner's 1947 interview with Franz Becker. He found interrogation transcripts of captured German snipers, including Heinrich Müller's account of his final duel. He located Müller's letter to his brother Ernst, donated to the Imperial War Museum in 1981. He found Hauptmann Joseph Krebs's personal journal describing the unauthorized weapons test in the schoolhouse near St. Vith. Hoffmann spent 2 years assembling these fragments. In 2018, he published a technical monograph titled "Industrial Failure and Combat Defeat: The Collapse of German Small Arms Reliability, 1943-1945. The book is 412 pages long, dense with metallurgical data, production statistics, and first-person accounts. It was reviewed in 3 academic journals and sold fewer than 800 copies. But within the community of military historians and firearms researchers, the book became a reference standard. It documented with meticulous precision how a single industrial failure, the substitution of substandard steel in rifle production, contributed to the deaths of thousands of soldiers who believed their weapons would not fail them. In 2019, Hoffmann delivered a lecture at the University of Freiburg. He projected an image on the screen. A disassembled Carabiner 98K, its barrel cut in cross-section, showing microscopic fractures in the steel. He described how those fractures, invisible to the naked eye, detectable only through metallurgical analysis, represented the difference between a rifle that fired true and a rifle that jammed at the critical moment. "This is not a story about rifles," Hoffmann said. "This is a story about listening." Franz Becker warned them in 1943. Heinrich Müller documented it in 1945. Joseph Krebs demonstrated it under fire, and every one of them was ignored because the truth was inconvenient. After the lecture, a veteran of the Bundeswehr approached Hoffmann. The veteran was in his 70s, too young to have served in the Second World War, but old enough to have trained with veterans who had. He asked Hoffmann if the soldiers knew their rifles were failing. Hoffmann said yes, the soldiers knew. The snipers especially knew. They kept fighting because they had no choice, but they understood the mathematics of their defeat. The veteran asked, "Did it change anything, the reports, the warnings, the documentation?" Hoffmann said no. It changed nothing during the war, but it changed the historical record. It ensured that when future generations studied the collapse of German military effectiveness, they would understand it was not solely a failure of strategy or manpower. It was also a failure of steel, of industrial oversight, of command structures that prioritized production numbers over combat functionality. "The men who fought with those rifles deserve that clarity," Hoffmann said. In 2021, the Imperial War Museum in London hosted an exhibition titled "The Engineers' War: Technology and Tragedy, 1939 to 1945. One display case contained Heinrich Müller's letter to his brother, displayed alongside a Carabiner 98K manufactured in October 1944 and an M1 Garand captured by British forces in 1945. The placard read, "These two rifles represent the industrial disparity that determined the outcome of countless individual engagements on the Western Front." The German rifle was built with compromised materials under desperate conditions. The American rifle was built with consistent quality from a secure industrial base. The soldiers who carried them had no control over that difference. Visitors to the museum stop at the display, read the letter, and examine the rifles. Some understand immediately. Others require the context provided by the placard, but all of them leave with the same realization. Wars are not won solely by courage or tactics. They are won by the steel that holds true when men need it most. Franz Becker died in 1969, having never seen his warnings validated. Heinrich Müller died in 1998, at the age of 78, in a small village near Stuttgart. Joseph Krebs died in 1987, having worked as a civil engineer for 4 decades after the war. None of them lived to see their accounts compiled into a coherent historical record, but the steel remembers. The fractured barrels, the worn extractors, the deformed firing pins. They remain in museum collections, in university research labs, in private collections of military historians. They are physical evidence of an industrial collapse that was predicted, documented, and ignored. The rifles are silent now. They do not fire. They do not fail. They simply exist as artifacts of a war that demanded more from its machinery than its machinery could provide. And in their silence, they testify to a truth that took 70 years to fully articulate. The war was not lost in a single battle. It was lost in increments, in 10,000 small defeats, in duels where German snipers worked bolts while American riflemen fired 8 times. It was lost in factories where engineers were silenced. It was lost in decisions to prioritize production over quality. It was lost in the substitution of manganese with cheaper alloys. It was lost in the metallurgical composition of steel that warped under sustained fire. The men who carried those rifles understood this long before the historians did. They wrote letters, filed reports, and testified after the war. They told the truth about the steel, and the steel in its fractured barrels and worn components told the truth about the war. Hoffmann concluded his monograph with a quote from Heinrich Müller's letter, "Tell our mother I tried. Tell her I did everything I was trained to do. But tell her also that I was given a rifle that could not do what I needed it to do, and that is not a failure of will. It is a failure of steel. The steel failed. The men did not." And in the archives, in the museums, in the yellowed pages of reports that no one read during the war, that distinction finally becomes clear. The war ended. The rifles were scrapped, but the records remain, testimony to the engineers who warned, the soldiers who fought, and the metal that could not hold. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of the German snipers who discovered why they were losing every duel. See you in the next video.